Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Alexis Batulis with Columbus, US, and today we have a special presentation for you on Microsoft GP Workflow, a few things to know before you start. We started the call by putting everyone on mute, so if you have any questions during today's presentation, please use the question box on the upper right-hand side of the screen to ask any questions that may come up. At the end, we'll have time for a Q&A with our presenter. Finally, we are recording this session and we'll be sending a link to all attendees within an hour after this live webcast. Now I'm excited to introduce your presenter today, Marie Rogers. Marie is a senior implementation consultant at Columbus, based out of Houston, Texas. She will be with Columbus for 10 years in July. She started working with Great Plains in 1995 as a consultant. In addition to working with all the core modules, including GP Workflow, she has implemented fixed assets, analytical accounting, multi-entity management modules, as well as writing financial reports in Management Reporter. On the technical side of Great Plains, Marie has installed, migrated, and upgraded many versions, starting with version 4. So without further ado, Marie, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Alexis. Good afternoon, everybody. Today we'll go ahead and get started. The topics for today, we're going to cover the starting of your workflow. First things first, starting your workflow. I'm going to give you some tips to set up GP Workflow. We're going to talk about system setup overviews, approvals, email actions, document attach, company workflow administration, and the calendar setup. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to try to give you some GP workflow cases as we go. And then finally, at the end, we'll have an opportunity for questions for you to ask. So let's get started. There's a few questions that need to be answered before you plan on starting to use workflow. If your organization is using a version of Great Plains or higher, GP 2013, sorry, R2 or higher, that's when the workflow started in this version, but it's been advanced along the way up to 18.2. So if you are on an earlier version than GP 2013, or you'd like to take advantage of some of the other features in later versions, Columbus can certainly help you upgrade to GP 2018. The other question is, are all of your users on the same Active Directory domain? This is important because GP Workflow doesn't support multiple domains. So that is basically, you know, in your email address, if you have, in my case, Marie, M-A-R-R at columbusglobal.com. Columbus Global is my Active Directory domain. The other thing is, are you using Office 365 or Microsoft Exchange for your email delivery system? That's another important thing that you'll need. It doesn't support Yahoo or Gmail, that type of thing. So you'll want to make sure that you're using a Microsoft email delivery system. I wrote a blog a little bit ago, I guess it was in January, so you can check out my blog at this link. You could probably also Google my name and workflow and find it pretty quickly. Covers mainly these same subjects. Okay, so let's get started on the setup tips. There are two ways to set up the GP workflow in your organization. One is to enable email actions for workflow. That basically will allow a user, when the workflow is turned on, allow a user to go to a transaction and click a submit button. The the approval will be routed to the approver via email. The approver can log into Great Plains and find that transaction, or click in the email. There'll be a link back to Great Plains. If they have Great Plains open and they're logged in, they can go ahead and approve within Great Plains. If you enable the email actions, you can also approve your workflow assignments inside of Great Plains or outside of Great Plains via email. So the message, if you're using the enable email actions, the message will have hyperlinks in it, and you can click one of those hyperlinks, whether it's approve, reject, or delegate, and it will allow you to approve the workflow via your email. This is ideal for non-GP users that are approvers. Let's take a look at that setup screen. It's under the Administration Setup System Workflow. And this is where the two sections are defined. The top section is what we talked about, enabling, just turning on the workflow to where each approver will receive an email, but they will have to log into Great Plains to approve it. When you enable the bottom section, that's the one where you your approvers can click a hyperlink and approve or reject or delegate the email from there. The bottom half requires that you have GP Web Services installed and configured on your SQL Server where your GP databases reside. I would also suggest using or creating an email address or an email account for GP Workflow so that it can be the email account that manages your emails that are being sent to your approvers. You'll notice here then we have our server address, Office 365 in this case, and then we are enabling our email action here in this sample and giving this the server name where the GP is installed. The other thing that you might want to consider to kind of enhance your workflow is to turn on the document attachments. Under the Administration Company Document Attach Setup, there's a setup screen there where you can turn on your attachments for any of your master records like vendors, customers, items, all sorts of, any of your master records. I even think your GL account. So you can attach documents to any of those master records and also at the transaction level. So in an example of a master record, you might want to attach a W-9 to a vendor card. In the example of a transaction, you could attach an invoice to the AP transaction or a quote to a purchase order. So anytime you're in Great Plains and you see a paperclip on the toolbar across the top, that indicates that you can attach a document to that either transaction or master record. The reason why you want to do this with workflow is because you can send the attachment along with the workflow approval. So let's get started talking about the company and the company setup and the features that are available on the company side of workflow. Under Administration, Setup, Company, Workflow, Workflow Maintenance. This is where you begin setting up your steps and your workflows. You can use workflow in any of these places throughout Great Plains. The General Ledger account, General Ledger batch, Receivables batch, Sales transactions, Payables batch, Payables transaction, Purchase order, Purchase requisition, Purchasing invoice, Receiving transaction, Vendor approval. Also on payroll. employee profiles, employee skills, payroll direct deposit, payroll time cards, payroll W-4. Project has some as well, expense reports and timesheets if you're using Project. And on the administration side, SmartList designer views. Also on 18.2, they added security roles, security tasks, user approvals, and user security. Another thing that's important to set up on your workflow is your workflow calendar. And this feature helps manage your workflow when you have a time limit set up on your workflow. So if you were to submit a workflow on Friday and you had a limit of 2 days for it to be approved, it would be past due on Monday by the time the user came back in. So by changing your work days and setting them up 8 to 5, so that, and if you work on Saturday, half day, change that, you know, anytime that you want your workflows to work through your business calendar. So you would go ahead and just set that up. There's also an ability to add non-working days. So Thanksgiving, Christmas, if you have these holidays off, you'd want to go ahead and put those in, and then that way it'll not it'll help manage your workflow approval so they won't be expired. The other thing that the GP workflow offers is a customized email message. So there's quite a few standard email templates out there that you can get started with. They have an asterisk at the end. And you can go through and set up your, or change, you can either use these default workflow email messages for each type of workflow. So you'll notice that this is a purchasing series for a purchase requisition approval. You'll also see these hooks without. These are basically a bracket and a percent sign. Anytime you see a word encompassed between those, you'll see that it's a hook, basically, to pull in data from your system. So when you're looking at the line, the subject line, you can see requisition number, you can see the call center. In this particular case, if you look at the right, here's a sample of a requisition approval email that the user would receive. And on the left is the setup in the system. So you'll see you'll have your company name, your purchase requisition number, requested by, date, due date, that type of information. You'll also see this approve, reject, and delegate. And this tells you that this user can approve via email by clicking the approve. Anytime you click approve, you'll get a comment box and you can type it in. Anytime, same type of thing with reject and delegate. Anytime you click these hyperlinks, you'll have a comment box to make your comments. Down at the bottom, there's additional document lines that you can add to some of the workflow email messages. It depends on the type. You know, for instance, if it has details to add, you can add a line item detail in your workflow so that the person that is receiving the email and is asked to approve has more information. It's important to set up a workflow manager and assign that manager to the workflow. So in this case, what we're doing is we've got like a new workflow set up here. We called it vendor approval, and I'm sorry, this is the vendor approval workflow. You have to assign a manager for any of the workflow that you set up under this group. It looks like it's grayed out, but if you click the magnifying glass, you'll see that you have an opportunity to choose a user or a user group. The workflow manager is important to set up because if for some reason someone has been removed from the workflow, has been removed from Active Directory, and they have a workflow assigned to them, instead of trying to send it to that user, it'll bypass that user and go to the manager. Now, one thing to remember is that when you're using GP workflow, it doesn't matter who you're logged into GP as. It only matters who you're logged into your Active Directory login. So if you're logged in as yourself, then that's how you're going to get the email messages. It's going to know using Active Directory. So this is your network login. So you could be logged in as anybody in Great Plains, but if you initiate a workflow, it's still going to be sent from whoever the user is that's logged in on that computer. So if I set up a new workflow down here, vendor, and I called it vendor, a new vendor, there's an active box, and it'll show you down here, gives you a visual cue that this is an active workflow within the vendor approval workflow. I can set up more than one of them, but only one of them can be active at a time for each one of these types. You can also send notifications via email to the originator on where the status of these types of, to kind of keep track of the status of these types of things. So if you submit an approval and it goes out to the user to be approved, it can also send you an email if it was approved, if the task was complete, if it's been delegated, been recalled, and then final approval. So you can turn all of these on or none of these on, or just a few that might make sense to have the originator stay in touch with where the approval process is. You can also send a carbon copy to anybody else that's in Active Directory, that's a user or a user group. Also, down in the bottom section, you can choose what to do if the task is overdue. Based on that calendar, when you get into the workflow steps, you'll be able to give it a time limit. And it's going to look at the calendar and decide, okay, is this overdue? And then what do I do with it? Do you take no action, escalate to the next approver, or escalate to somebody in particular? When you look at the workflow conditions, say we're setting up a new workflow. This is our vendor approval workflow step. So this is our first step, and we define what the step name is in the description. And you can set up a condition. You can either have no condition at all, it always goes to this person for approval, or you can activate some actions or some conditions that have to be met in order for this workflow to be routed to the person that you've assigned. Here's a sample of kind of what you could do with a purchase order. Like in this case, it can go in two directions. Any PO for Northwood Traders must go to Frank first in this particular section. And then it goes on to Andreas and Anne. Another way that you could set it up is by the dollar amount. Sue could submit a purchase order, and it must go to Jill if it's greater than $10,000 for approval, then to Sue for $20,000, or John, $30,000. So you can use it either way or kind of together. So in some cases, it might always need to go to one person first, and then it can go up through the dollar amount approval. So this is the part that you need to think about when you're starting to plan your workflow, is how do you want these to be routed through to the final approver. So down here at the bottom of the window is where you tell it who are you going to assign the workflow to. It can be a user, individual, visible, I can't say the word, a user or a user group. Then you can set the time limit, the hours, and you can apply the workflow calendar. And if you don't apply the workflow calendar, we can have that particular scenario we talked about earlier, which it could be overdue before it, the week is up. So we also can set up reminders for every 4 hours or days or weeks. So you have options to set up any kind of time limit that you require. I recently set up one for 2 weeks and then a reminder every 1 week. And then you always want to mark the box to send the message. And this is the custom message that we talked about earlier. And then we always want to make sure that we have this box marked to include document attachments. In the case that you're using a user group, a group of users that are set up in Active Directory, you can have this policy set up to where only one response is needed, majority must approve, or all must approve. Also, if you're using Active Directory hierarchy, you may want to check with your IT department to find out a little bit more about that. But in Active Directory, you can set up a hierarchy that basically has the users already defined in their department and who their managers are. And in that case, you might be able to use the hierarchy to manage your workflow and have it flow through to a user's manager. So if we look at it from, setting up a new vendor, if we go to the vendor maintenance window, what we'll see now is a paperclip so that we can attach our W-9 or any other documents that we might need. And then we would see the submit button available. A user would enter their vendor maintenance, in their vendor maintenance, the new vendor, all the information required there. This is the same with the transaction as well. Then they would click the submit button. Once they click the submit button, the email is sent to the approver for the first step. And then you'll notice if you pull this vendor back up again, you'll have a status here that has the vendor approval pending approval and the date that it's due and the time that it's due. You also notice you'll have a recall button if you wanted to recall it. So say maybe you forgot to change something or add something, you could recall it and then resubmit it. Once you hit the recall button, make your change, there'll be a submit button again that you can submit it. Another thing, there's a view history icon here, right next to the recall. When you click that, you get a kind of a flow of what has happened so far with your workflow, where the status is. It shows that it's been originated, the vendor that it's pending vendor approval, that type of thing. Another thing you can do is print a workflow history report. It's under Administration Reports Company, Workflow History. And you can pull the report different types based on in different ranges. So if you wanted to change the criteria to be just a workflow manager and put that workflow manager's name in here, you can insert that and pull that information specifically. So you could do ranges based on any of these different options. Another way to determine where your workflow is and the status is using the navigation lists. They're available on your window on the left-hand side here. Excuse me, in this case, we have purchasing. The vendors, under the vendor section, if you expand that, you see vendors that are not submitted and vendors that are pending approval. And then you can look through here and see that this is the status of any of the new vendors that have been created and submitted for approval. Now, if you're the approver, you can mark these boxes and click the approve and approve it from this window as well. Let's talk about delegating. So say, for instance, someone was going on vacation. You can delegate your tasks to someone while you're on vacation by going to Microsoft Dynamics GP drop-down menu, user preferences, and workflow delegations. You can choose either for all types or by workflow type, and there's an example on the right for that. And then you have all workflow types are going to be delegated to Eunice Hayes, and when to start and when to end. So if I'm going to be gone for a week, I just set it up to delegate for that week, and then when I come back, it will then I'll be able to approve my messages myself, and it won't be delegated. Then we can do it by we can set this up by workflow type, vendor approval type, whether it's a PO I have to approve. I can set that up. Maybe it's different people for my different approvals. Now on 18.2, there is an option that in case there's, it's similar to the delegate, but in case somebody has an unexpected absence and they have workflow that has been assigned to them, workflow tasks or approvals, and they all of a sudden were in an accident or some reason that they couldn't come back to work, you can go through and in the setup of the workflow, edit the workflow approver and assign that approver all those approval tasks to somebody else. I found that this was a big need in the past because, sometimes if a person wasn't able to change their or delegate their workflow, it was difficult to get that changed from the administrator side. So that's a conclusion of what I wanted to show you today. Do you guys have any questions?
Thanks so much, Marie. I do see a question here on whether or not the slide deck will be available, and the answer to that is yes. You'll just need to reach out to us-marketing@columbusglobal.com and we can give you the PDF of these slides. Are there any other questions from the group here? Okay, we have one from Ben. Can you use workflows with people not in your Active Directory?
No, the users must be in the Active Directory on the same domain to be able to use the GP workflow.
Oh, we have another question on copy of the presentation, and yes, you just need to reach out to us-marketing@columbusglobal.com and we can get that to you. We'll give it a couple more seconds here. Any other questions? All right. Here's a question from Richard. How to configure the GP web service?
So basically, it's going through the configuration in the web services. So basically, you install the web services and then you go through the configuration, and you're basically telling it which company's databases you want to use GP web services with. So it's basically just going through and assigning which companies you want to use web services with, and then letting the process, basically take place. So you just kind of click next once you've chosen your companies, and it configures it for you.
All right, great. If there are no additional questions, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's presentation. Again, if you have any additional questions, please reach out to us. Thank you so much, Marie, for giving us a great overview of Microsoft GP Workflow.
Thank
That
you. Thank you
concludes
all
our
for joining.
webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Bye.